The moment my mother-in-law Patricia walked through my front door with 3 suitcases and a folder labeled House Rules, announcing she was moving into her son's house permanently, I knew my carefully built life was about to crumble. She stood there in my marble-tiled entryway, her silver hair perfectly styled and her emerald suit immaculate, surveying my home like a general inspecting conquered territory. "Well, Jessica," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no, "I suppose we should discuss how this household is going to operate now that I'm here to restore some proper order." Little did she know that the property deed tucked away in my home office safe had only one name on it: Jessica Marie Thompson. Not her son's, not both of ours, just mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in my quiet suburban life. I was standing in my kitchen, the one I'd designed myself with its white quartz countertops and subway tile backsplash, making coffee in the French press that had become my morning ritual. The early autumn light streamed through the bay window that overlooked the garden I'd spent 2 years perfecting, and everything felt peaceful in the way that only comes when you're exactly where you're supposed to be. My husband Ryan had left for his accounting firm an hour earlier, kissing me goodbye and mumbling something about working late on quarterly reports. It was a routine we'd settled into over our 4 years of marriage, comfortable and predictable in the best possible way. He handled the numbers and spreadsheets that made his orderly mind happy, while I managed my freelance graphic design business from the converted bedroom upstairs that served as my office. The house itself was a testament to compromise and careful planning. We'd bought it 3 years ago in Millbrook Heights, a tree-lined neighborhood in Ohio, where young professionals could afford mortgage payments without sacrificing every other dream they'd ever had. It was a modest colonial with 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and enough character to make it feel like home without being so much space that we'd rattle around like strangers. I'd fallen in love with it the moment our realtor, a chatty woman named Linda Morrison, had shown us through the front door. The hardwood floors needed refinishing and the kitchen required a complete renovation, but I could see past the surface flaws to the potential underneath. More importantly, I could see Ryan and me building a life here, hosting dinner parties in the dining room and maybe someday watching children play in the fenced backyard. What made the house truly ours, though, was something Ryan didn't know and something I'd never felt the need to explain in detail. When we'd applied for the mortgage, my credit score had been significantly higher than his. I'd been religiously paying off student loans and building credit history since college, while Ryan had made some financial mistakes in his early 20s that still showed up on background checks. Nothing serious, just late payments on credit cards and a car loan that had gone into default when he'd been briefly unemployed after graduation. The mortgage broker, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd looked perpetually concerned about everyone's financial future, had suggested that the loan would be more likely to get approved if it was in my name alone. "Just temporarily," he'd assured us, "until your husband's credit improves. You can always add him to the deed later if you want to." Ryan had been embarrassed but practical about the arrangement. "Whatever gets us the house," he'd said, his jaw tight with the particular frustration of a man who was used to being in control but had to admit his girlfriend was better with money. "We can sort out the paperwork later once my credit score recovers," but later had somehow never come. The mortgage payments were automatically deducted from my business account, the property taxes came in my name, and the deed remained exactly as it had been on closing day: Jessica Marie Thompson, sole owner. It wasn't intentional secrecy, exactly, more like one of those administrative details that gets buried under the daily business of actually living in a place. Ryan never asked about adding his name to the deed, and I never brought it up. The house felt like ours in every way that mattered. We'd chosen the paint colors together, argued about furniture placement, and split the utility bills down the middle. The fact that the legal ownership rested with me alone seemed like a technicality that had no bearing on our actual relationship. Besides, Ryan's contributions to our life together went far beyond mortgage payments. He was the one who researched contractors when we needed the roof repaired, who spent weekends helping me install new light fixtures, and who patiently held pieces of furniture while I decided whether they looked better against the north wall or the south wall. The house was made physical, regardless of whose name was on official documents. His mother, Patricia, however, had never quite grasped this collaborative approach to homeownership. From the moment Ryan had introduced us during our engagement, she'd referred to whatever place he lived as Ryan's house or Ryan's apartment, as if his female companions were temporary occupants rather than equal partners. When we'd moved into the Millbrook Heights house, she'd walked through it once and immediately started talking about what Ryan should do with the guest bathroom and how Ryan might want to landscape the backyard. I'd found it mildly irritating, but ultimately harmless. Patricia was a widow who'd raised Ryan as a single mother after his father died in a construction accident when Ryan was 12. She'd worked as an executive assistant for a law firm for 30 years, supporting them both with the kind of fierce determination that left little room for sentimentality or collaborative decision-making. In her world, someone was always in charge, and that someone was usually her. Her interference in our decorating choices and household management had seemed like the natural extension of a woman who'd spent decades making all the decisions for her family. I'd learned to smile and nod when she suggested we needed different curtains or recommended a particular cleaning service, then do exactly what Ryan and I had planned to do anyway. She meant well, and her opinions rarely affected our actual daily life. What I hadn't anticipated was that Patricia's concept of family hierarchy would eventually extend beyond interior design suggestions to actual living arrangements. The phone call had come 3 days earlier, on a Saturday morning when Ryan and I were lingering over breakfast and debating whether to spend the day antiquing or working in the garden. Ryan's phone had buzzed against the kitchen table, and he'd glanced at it with the resigned expression he always wore when his mother's name appeared on the caller ID. "Hi, Mom," he'd answered, his voice taking on the slightly careful tone he used when he was preparing for whatever storm might be brewing on the other end of the line. I couldn't hear Patricia's side of the conversation, but I could track its progression through the changes in Ryan's facial expression. Initial polite attention gave way to surprise, then concern, then something that looked suspiciously like panic. He'd started making small noises of agreement and reassurance, the kind of sounds people make when they're being overwhelmed by information and don't have time to process it properly. "Okay," he'd said finally. "Okay, Mom, slow down. Let me make sure I understand this correctly." I'd set down my coffee cup and given him my full attention, trying to piece together the crisis from his half of the conversation. Something about Patricia's apartment building, something about construction and safety violations and temporary displacement of residents. Ryan's face had grown increasingly pale as he listened to what sounded like a lengthy explanation of bureaucratic complications and housing emergencies. "How long are we talking about?" he'd asked, and the way his voice cracked slightly on the word long had sent a chill down my spine. More listening, more nodding, more of those non-committal sounds that indicated he was being told rather than consulted about whatever solution his mother had already decided upon. "Of course," he'd said finally. "Of course you can stay here. It's your son's house, you're always welcome." That phrase, "your son's house," had hit me like a small electric shock, not because it was technically incorrect, but because of the automatic way Ryan had said it, like he was reciting something he'd been taught, rather than describing something he'd chosen. In that moment, our partnership in home ownership had been reduced to his inheritance and my tolerance, and I'd felt something shift in my chest that I couldn't quite name. The conversation had continued for another 10 minutes, with Ryan asking practical questions about timing and belongings and Patricia's needs during what she was calling her, quote, temporary transition period. When he'd finally hung up, he'd looked at me with the expression of someone who'd just been informed that a natural disaster was heading directly for his house. "So," I'd said carefully, "your mother needs a place to stay?" "The city condemned her apartment building," Ryan had explained, running his hands through his dark hair in the gesture he always made when he was stressed. "Some kind of structural problem with the foundation that's going to take months to fix. All the residents have to be out by the end of the week." "That's terrible. Where is she planning to go?" Ryan had looked at me like I'd asked him to explain quantum physics to a kindergartner. "Here, obviously. I mean, this is my house. She raised me, Jess. I can't exactly tell her to find a hotel." There it was again. My house. delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to make unilateral decisions about our shared living space. I'd felt that same electric shock, stronger this time, followed by something that might have been anger or might have been hurt. Our house, I'd corrected gently. And of course she's welcome to stay here while she figures out her housing situation. I just wish you'd discussed it with me before telling her yes. Ryan had blinked at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. Discussed it? Jess, she's my mother. She needs help. What was I supposed to say? Let me check with my wife and get back to you. That's exactly what you were supposed to say. This is my home too, and decisions about who lives here should be decisions we make together. But even as I'd said it, I'd known that the conversation was already over. In Ryan's mind, his mother's emergency trumped any need for spousal consultation, and my role was to accommodate whatever arrangements he'd already agreed to. It was a glimpse into a dynamic I'd never fully recognized before, the way he saw our partnership as conditional on my willingness to support whatever his family needed from him. We'd spent the rest of that weekend preparing the guest bedroom and clearing space in the coat closet for Patricia's belongings. Ryan had been energetic and helpful, throwing himself into cleaning and organizing with the enthusiasm of someone who was relieved to have concrete tasks instead of complicated conversations. I'd gone along with the preparations, telling myself that it was temporary and that being a good wife meant being flexible when family emergencies arose. What I hadn't prepared for was the way Patricia would walk into our home not as a grateful guest, but as someone reclaiming territory that had always belonged to her. She'd arrived on Tuesday morning in a taxi, loaded with enough luggage for a month-long vacation, wearing that emerald suit and an expression of calm authority that suggested she'd already mentally rearranged our entire household to suit her preferences. The driver had helped her carry in 3 suitcases, 2 garment bags, and a large box that appeared to contain framed photographs and other personal items she'd deemed essential for her temporary stay. "Jessica, dear," she'd said when I'd opened the front door, her voice carrying the kind of forced warmth that people use when they're being polite to service workers. "I hope you've prepared the blue bedroom for me. I'll need the ensuite bathroom, of course, and I assume you've cleared adequate closet space." It was a question that wasn't really a question, delivered with the assumption that her preferences had already been anticipated and accommodated. I'd stood in my own doorway feeling like I was being interviewed for a position I hadn't applied for, watching this woman catalog my home's amenities, like she was evaluating a hotel room. "Of course," I'd managed, stepping aside to let her pass. "Ryan prepared everything yesterday. The guest room should have everything you need." "Ryan's room," she'd corrected automatically, as if I'd made some fundamental error in geography. "The guest room in Ryan's house." And that's when I'd known that the next few weeks weren't going to be about a mother staying with her son's family during a housing emergency. They were going to be about a woman reclaiming what she'd apparently always considered her territory, and my place in that territory was something she was still calculating. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Within 24 hours of Patricia's arrival, my carefully organized life had been turned completely upside down. I discovered this at 6:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning, when I padded downstairs in my pajamas and slippers, looking forward to my usual quiet coffee ritual, only to find Patricia standing in my kitchen wearing a burgundy silk robe and reorganizing my spice cabinet. "Good morning, Jessica," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been awake for hours and had already accomplished more before breakfast than most people did all day. "I've taken the liberty of alphabetizing your seasonings. The way you had them arranged was quite chaotic." I stood frozen in my own doorway, watching this woman methodically relocate my carefully organized cooking supplies to locations that made sense to her but bore no relationship to how I actually used my kitchen. The paprika, which I kept next to the salt because I used them together frequently, had been moved to the pea section between oregano and red pepper flakes. The vanilla extract I used for weekend baking was now buried behind turmeric and white pepper in alphabetical order. "I also took the liberty of reviewing your coffee situation," Patricia continued, finally turning to face me with the satisfied expression of someone who'd identified a problem and solved it. That French press is terribly inefficient for a household of 3. I've ordered a proper coffee maker that should arrive this afternoon. Something with a timer and programmable settings. The French press in question sat on the counter looking somehow smaller and more inadequate than it had the day before. It was a wedding gift from my college roommate Sarah, who'd known about my morning coffee ritual and had chosen it specifically because it made one perfect cup at exactly the strength I preferred. I'd used it every single morning for 4 years, and it had never once felt inefficient until Patricia had pronounced it so. "That's very thoughtful," I managed, though my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. "But you really didn't need to." "Nonsense," Patricia interrupted with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "I'm going to be living here for the foreseeable future, and we need systems that work for everyone. Speaking of which, I've prepared a household schedule that should help us all coexist more harmoniously." She reached into the pocket of her robe and produced a folded piece of paper, which she handed to me with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting important legal documents. I unfolded it to discover a detailed chart listing wake-up times, bathroom usage schedules, meal preparation assignments, and television viewing rotations. According to Patricia's plan, I was assigned kitchen duties on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, while she would handle Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday cooking. Sunday was listed as family dinner day. Jessica assists Patricia. The bathroom schedule gave me access to my own master bathroom from 6 o'clock to 6:30 a.m., and again from 9 o'clock to 9:30 p.m., with a note that shower usage should be limited to conserve hot water for all residents. "This is very detailed," I said slowly, reading through assignments for laundry day, grocery shopping responsibilities, and something called common area maintenance that appeared to involve a rotating schedule of dusting and vacuuming duties. "Organization is the key to peaceful cohabitation," Patricia replied, pulling open cabinet doors to survey the changes she'd made to my spice arrangement. I learned that during my years managing the Henderson Law Office, when people don't have clear expectations and defined roles, chaos inevitably follows. The comparison to her workplace was particularly jarring because it positioned her as the office manager and me as some kind of junior employee who needed supervision and clearly defined duties. I found myself wondering when exactly I'd been demoted from homeowner to household staff in a place where I'd been making my own coffee and organizing my own spices for 3 years. "Patricia," I said carefully, trying to find a diplomatic way to reclaim some authority over my own morning routine. "I appreciate you wanting to help, but I think we should probably discuss any major changes before implementing them. This is my home too, and I have my own systems that work well for me." She turned to look at me with the patient expression adults use when children say something adorable but fundamentally misguided. "Oh dear, I think there's been some confusion. This is Ryan's house, Jessica. You're his wife, which of course makes you welcome here, but Ryan is the head of this household. I'm simply helping him establish some proper order since he's been too polite to address these organizational issues himself." The words hit me like cold water, not just because of their content, but because of the absolute confidence with which she delivered them. In Patricia's mind, there was no question about the hierarchy of our household. Ryan owned the house by virtue of being male and the family breadwinner. I lived here by virtue of being married to him, and she had authority over both of us by virtue of being his mother. "Actually," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I'd intended, "Ryan and I bought this house together. Both of our names are on the mortgage, and we make all household decisions as partners." It was a slight exaggeration since only my name was on the deed, but I wasn't ready to get into the technicalities of our financial arrangements with someone who'd just assigned me a bathroom schedule in my own home. Patricia's smile became more patronizing, if such a thing was possible. "How modern of you both to think that way. But the reality is that Ryan works full-time to support this household, while you do your little art projects from home. The financial responsibility rests with him, which makes this his house and his decisions to make." My little art projects generated nearly $60,000 a year in income, which was more than enough to cover the mortgage payments and most of our living expenses, but I realized that explaining this to Patricia would be pointless. She'd already decided that my work didn't count as real employment, because it happened at home and involved creativity rather than corporate hierarchy. The sound of Ryan's footsteps on the stairs interrupted what was becoming an increasingly tense conversation. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking freshly showered and professionally dressed, ready for another day of managing other people's tax obligations and quarterly reports. "Morning, Mom, morning, babe," he said, dropping a quick kiss on my forehead before moving to the refrigerator for his usual orange juice. "How's everyone settling in?" "Wonderfully," Patricia replied before I could speak. "I've been helping Jessica understand how we can all live together more efficiently. I think she's going to appreciate having some structure around here." Ryan glanced at the schedule in my hands and nodded approvingly. "That's great, Mom. Jess, isn't this helpful? I know you've been feeling overwhelmed trying to manage everything on your own." I stared at my husband, wondering when exactly I'd expressed feeling overwhelmed and when I'd asked for help managing my own household. The truth was that I'd been managing everything just fine until yesterday, when suddenly my competence at running my own home had been called into question by people who thought I needed supervision and assigned tasks. "It's very thorough," I said neutrally, not trusting myself to say more without starting an argument that would ultimately pit me against both Ryan and his mother. "I'm also updating some of the organizational systems," Patricia continued, gesturing toward the rearranged spice cabinet. "Poor Jessica has been trying to maintain this big house without proper systems in place. It's no wonder things have been so chaotic." Again, I wondered when my house had been designated as chaotic. And by whom? Yesterday morning I'd known exactly where everything was, and could prepare breakfast without opening a single wrong cabinet door. Today, I couldn't find the cinnamon because it had been moved to the C section, far from the coffee supplies where I'd always kept it. Ryan examined Patricia's organizational improvements with the approval of someone who'd grown up with her systems and found comfort in their familiar logic. "This makes much more sense," he said, opening the cabinet where turmeric and thyme were now neatly lined up in alphabetical order. "Thanks, Mom. I should have thought to help Jess get organized sooner." The casual assumption that I needed organizational help from people who'd been living in my house for less than 48 hours was breathtaking in its presumption. But what was even more disturbing was the way Ryan automatically deferred to his mother's assessment of how our household should function, as if her preferences superseded any systems we'd already established together. "I've also ordered a proper coffee maker," Patricia added, glancing dismissively at my French press. "Something more suitable for a family household." "Good thinking," Ryan said, pouring his orange juice into a travel mug. That thing never made enough coffee anyway. Which was true if you were trying to serve 3 people, but completely wrong if you were making coffee for one person who preferred the ritual of preparing exactly what she wanted at exactly the strength she preferred. The French press had been perfect for my needs, but my needs had apparently become irrelevant now that we were operating as a family household under Patricia's management. I watched my husband and his mother discuss improvements to my home as if I weren't standing right there, and felt something cold settling in my stomach. This wasn't a temporary arrangement where a displaced family member was staying with us until she found alternative housing. This was a reorganization of our household hierarchy, with Patricia at the top, Ryan as her lieutenant, and me as the person whose previous independence had been an unfortunate oversight that was now being corrected. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation about whether we needed a better system for managing mail and household bills. Ryan glanced at his watch and frowned. "Expecting someone?" he asked, looking at me like deliveries to our house were somehow my responsibility. "I'm not," I replied, "but maybe it's Patricia's coffee maker." "Already?" Patricia looked pleased. "I paid for express delivery. No point in suffering with inadequate coffee when the solution is just a phone call away." She moved toward the front door with the confidence of someone answering her own doorbell, and I followed behind, feeling increasingly like a guest in my own home. The delivery driver stood on my front porch with a large box and an electronic clipboard, looking cheerfully professional in the way that comes from making dozens of similar deliveries every day. "Delivery for Patricia Hendricks," he announced, checking his paperwork. "That's me," Patricia replied, accepting the clipboard and signing for the package with the flourish of someone who was accustomed to making executive decisions about household purchases. "Wait," I said, my voice coming out louder than I'd intended. "You had this delivered to my house?" The delivery driver looked between Patricia and me with the expression of someone who'd accidentally walked into a family argument and wanted no part of it. "Well, naturally," Patricia said, as if I'd asked her to explain basic physics. "I'm living here now. Where else would I have my purchases delivered?" But this isn't your permanent address. This is supposed to be temporary, until your apartment building is repaired. Patricia's smile became arctic. Jessica, dear, these building repairs are going to take months, possibly longer. The structural damage is quite extensive. I'll be here for the foreseeable future, which means I need to establish this as my residence for practical purposes. The delivery driver cleared his throat diplomatically. If you could just sign for the package, ma'am. I have other deliveries to make. Patricia signed with a flourish and accepted the box, which was apparently heavy enough to require both her hands. The driver escaped quickly, leaving the three of us standing in my foyer with an expensive coffee maker that no one had consulted me about purchasing for my kitchen. Mom, Ryan said, looking slightly uncomfortable for the first time since this conversation had started. Maybe you should have checked with us before making purchases for the house. Checked with whom? Patricia replied. This is your house, Ryan. I'm your mother. I'm trying to make improvements that will benefit all of us. But Jess should probably have a say in what appliances we use, Ryan said weakly, glancing at me like he was hoping I'd agree that this was a reasonable compromise. Of course she should have input, Patricia agreed graciously. But the final decisions rest with the head of the household, which is you. I'm simply helping you make choices that will improve everyone's quality of life. And there it was, laid out as clearly as any legal document. Ryan was the head of the household, Patricia was his advisor, and I was the person whose input might be considered before decisions were made about my own home. The coffee maker box sat on my hall table like a monument to my diminished status in my own house. I looked at Ryan, waiting for him to correct his mother's understanding of how our partnership worked, waiting for him to explain that we made decisions together as equals, waiting for him to demonstrate some awareness that his wife might have legitimate authority in her own home. Instead, he checked his watch again and picked up his briefcase from the table beside the door. I've got to get to work, he said, giving Patricia a quick hug and me another distracted kiss. You two work out the coffee situation. I'm sure you'll figure out something that works for everyone. And with that, he was gone, leaving me standing in my own foyer with a woman who just established herself as the decision-maker in my house and a coffee maker I'd never wanted. Purchased with money I hadn't authorized to solve a problem I hadn't known I had. Patricia picked up the box with obvious satisfaction. Well, she said, shall we set this up? I think you'll find it much more efficient than your old method. I followed her back to the kitchen, watching her claim space on my counter for her new appliance, and realized that this was just the beginning. If Patricia could reorganize my spices and purchase new appliances in one morning, what would she accomplish by the end of the week? More importantly, what would be left of my home, my routines, and my sense of autonomy by the time her temporary stay was over? By the end of the first week, Patricia had transformed my home into something I barely recognized. What had started with reorganized spices and a new coffee maker had evolved into a complete household management takeover that left me feeling like a stranger in my own space. I discovered the full extent of her renovations on Friday morning when I walked into my home office to start work on a logo design for a local restaurant chain, only to find Patricia sitting at my desk using my computer to video chat with someone I didn't recognize. Oh, wonderful, she was saying to the woman on the screen, a silver-haired lady who appeared to be sitting in what looked like a hotel room. Yes, the house is quite spacious. Ryan has done very well for himself. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and the most charming garden area. She noticed me standing in the doorway and held up one finger in a gesture that clearly meant, wait your turn, before continuing her conversation. The neighborhood is excellent too, Margaret. Very family-oriented, good property values. I can see why Ryan chose this area to invest in. He always was smart about financial planning. Even as a boy, I stood there listening to Patricia describe my house, my neighborhood, and my husband's supposed real estate acumen to her friend, while sitting in my professional workspace using my equipment during my scheduled working hours. The casual appropriation of my office was stunning enough, but what made it worse was the way she discussed everything as if it were Ryan's sole domain and she were the proud mother showing off her son's accomplishments. Margaret, I'm going to have to call you back, Patricia said finally, apparently noticing my continued presence in the doorway. Jessica needs to use the computer for her little hobby work. She ended the call and turned to face me with the patient expression of someone being graciously accommodating despite an inconvenience. I hope you don't mind that I borrowed your office for a few minutes, she said, making no move to vacate my desk chair. I needed to catch up with some friends about my housing situation, and the lighting in here is so much better for video calls than the guest bedroom. This is my professional workspace, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I have client deadlines to meet today, and I need to use my computer and design software. Of course, dear. I'll just be a few more minutes. I promised to give Margaret a virtual tour of the house so she can see how nicely Ryan has set everything up. She's staying in a dreadful extended stay hotel while her own housing situation gets sorted out, and I thought it might cheer her to see a proper home environment. The assumption that I would wait for her to finish conducting social calls from my place of business was breathtaking. But what bothered me more was the continued narrative that everything around us was Ryan's achievement. My design work had contributed significantly to our ability to afford this house, my name was on the mortgage, and my taste had guided most of the decorating decisions, but in Patricia's version of events, I was essentially invisible. Patricia, I said firmly, I need you to understand that this is my office during business hours. I have paying clients who expect their projects completed on time, and I can't accommodate social calls during my work schedule. She looked at me with surprise, as if I'd made an unreasonable request instead of asking for access to my own workspace. Well, I suppose I could finish the tour later, though I did promise Margaret, but very well. Family obligations do come first, I suppose. The way she framed it, as if my need to work in my own office was a selfish demand that interfered with her family obligations, made my teeth clench. But she did stand up and gather the stack of papers she'd spread across my desk. Papers that appeared to be floor plans and furniture catalogs, rather than anything related to her housing crisis. What are these? I asked, picking up a page that showed detailed measurements of what looked suspiciously like my living room. Oh, just some ideas for improving the common areas, Patricia replied casually. I have a friend who's an interior decorator, and I thought it might be nice to update some of the furnishings while I'm here. Give Ryan a more sophisticated living environment. She handed me a catalog page showing leather furniture that probably cost more than my car, marked with notes about dimensions and color preferences. Another page showed window treatments that would completely change the warm, comfortable atmosphere Ryan and I had carefully created over 3 years of living together. You're planning to redecorate our house? I asked, staring at the catalog pages with growing disbelief. Ryan's house, Patricia corrected automatically. And not completely redecorate, just make some updates. Some of the furniture choices are a bit young couple starter home, if you know what I mean. Now that I'm living here, it makes sense to create a more mature, sophisticated environment. The casual dismissal of everything Ryan and I had chosen together was stunning. Every piece of furniture in our house had been selected after careful consideration of our budget, our lifestyle, and our personal taste. The overstuffed sectional sofa where we spent weekend mornings reading the newspaper together, the dining room table we'd found at an estate sale and refinished ourselves, the cheerful yellow walls I'd painted while Ryan held the ladder steady. All of it was apparently too juvenile for Patricia's vision of how her son should be living. Have you discussed this with Ryan? I asked. I'll mention it to him this evening. I'm sure he'll appreciate having his living space updated to reflect his professional success and adult status. The assumption that Ryan would automatically approve of his mother spending thousands of dollars redecorating our home without consulting his wife was either naive or deliberately dismissive of our partnership. Either way, it revealed how little Patricia understood or cared about the dynamic between Ryan and me. I set the catalogs down and looked around my office, noting that Patricia had also rearranged my desk supplies and moved several of my professional reference books to make room for her personal items. A framed photo of her and Ryan from his college graduation now sat where I usually kept my current project files, and her reading glasses were lying on top of my graphics tablet. Patricia, I need to be very clear about something, I said, choosing my words carefully. This office is my professional workspace, and I can't have it used for personal activities during business hours. I also need to be consulted before any changes are made to our home decor or furnishings. Her expression shifted from patient tolerance to something cooler and more calculating. Jessica, I understand that this transition might be difficult for you, but you need to remember that Ryan is the head of this household. As his mother, I have a responsibility to help him create a home environment that reflects his success and supports his goals. As his wife, I have a say in how our home is decorated and how our money is spent. Of course you do, dear. But when there are disagreements about what's best for the household, Ryan's judgment takes precedence. That's simply how functional families work. The casual way she dismissed my equal partnership in our marriage was breathtaking. In Patricia's worldview, I was essentially a junior partner whose opinions might be considered, but whose preferences could be overruled by male authority figures when necessary. "I think you misunderstand how our marriage works," I said, my voice getting sharper despite my efforts to stay diplomatic. "Ryan and I make decisions together as equals. Neither of us has veto power over the other when it comes to our home." Patricia's smile became patronizing in the way that made me want to throw something breakable. "How very modern of you both to think that way. But in practice, someone has to make the final decisions, and that someone is typically the person with the greater financial responsibility for the household." It was the second time she'd made assumptions about our financial arrangements, and this time I couldn't let it pass unchallenged. "Actually, I handle all of our mortgage payments and most of our household expenses," I said. "My income from freelance design work is quite substantial." "How lovely for you," Patricia replied, but her tone suggested she found my financial contributions about as significant as a child's allowance. "But Ryan's salary provides the stability and benefits that allow you to pursue your creative interests from home. Without his steady employment, you wouldn't have the luxury of working on art projects instead of getting a real job." The dismissal of my professional work as art projects and creative interests was infuriating, but what was worse was the implication that my income was somehow less legitimate because it came from freelance work instead of traditional employment. I'd built my graphic design business from nothing, developed a steady client base, and earned enough to carry our major household expenses. But in Patricia's estimation, none of that counted as real work because it didn't involve corporate hierarchy or traditional gender roles. "My design work generates nearly $60,000 a year," I said, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic restraint. "That's hardly hobby income." Patricia looked genuinely surprised, as if she'd never considered that someone working from home could earn a professional-level salary. But her surprise quickly shifted to something that looked suspiciously like disapproval. "Well," she said finally, "that's certainly more than I expected, but it's still irregular income, isn't it? Freelance work is inherently unstable. Ryan's salary provides the security that allows you to take those kinds of financial risks." Even when confronted with evidence that challenged her assumptions, Patricia managed to reframe the information in a way that maintained her narrative about household hierarchy and financial dependence. My income became irregular and risky, while Ryan's moderately successful accounting career became the foundation that made everything else possible. The sound of the front door opening interrupted our increasingly tense conversation. Heavy footsteps in the hallway announced Ryan's arrival home from work, earlier than usual for a Friday afternoon. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone home?" "In here, sweetheart?" Patricia called back, her voice instantly shifting to warm maternal tones. "Jessica and I were just discussing some exciting ideas for updating the house." Ryan appeared in the office doorway looking tired, but pleased to see his mother apparently getting along with his wife. He loosened his tie and smiled at the scene of domestic harmony he thought he was witnessing. "Hey babe," he said, giving me a quick kiss before turning his attention to Patricia. "What kind of updates are we talking about?" Patricia immediately launched into an enthusiastic description of her decorator friend's suggestions, showing Ryan the catalog pages and explaining how different furniture choices could create a more sophisticated living environment. She spoke with the confidence of someone presenting a business proposal to a decision-maker, and Ryan listened with the serious attention of someone being offered an appealing opportunity. "These pieces are beautiful, Mom," he said, examining a page showing a leather sectional that cost more than some people's cars. "Very professional looking. Much more grown-up than what we have now." I watched my husband evaluate furniture that would replace everything we'd chosen together, speaking as if our current home decor was something he'd outgrown, rather than something we'd created as a partnership. The ease with which he dismissed our shared choices in favor of his mother's vision was both hurtful and revealing. "They're also extremely expensive," I pointed out, looking at the price tags Patricia had carefully circled. "That sofa alone costs more than we budgeted for furniture for the entire year." "Well," Ryan said, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when he was about to suggest something he knew I wouldn't like, Maybe it's time to think about upgrading our budget. I got the promotion confirmation today, along with the salary increase we've been hoping for. This was the first I'd heard about a promotion, let alone a salary increase. The fact that Ryan was sharing this news with his mother and me simultaneously suggested that he'd already discussed it with her privately, probably during one of their morning coffee conversations in the kitchen I was no longer invited to use freely. That's wonderful news, I said, genuinely pleased about his professional success but confused about why I was learning about it in front of Patricia. When did you find out? They called this morning, just after I got to the office. I wanted to tell you both together so we could celebrate as a family. The inclusion of Patricia in what should have been a private moment between husband and wife was jarring, but what bothered me more was the implication that his raise automatically meant approval for his mother's expensive redecorating schemes. This is perfect timing, Patricia said, beaming at Ryan with obvious pride. Now you can afford to create the kind of living environment that reflects your professional success. Margaret is going to be so impressed when she sees how beautifully you've furnished your home. Again, the assumption that aesthetic choices were Ryan's sole prerogative, with my opinions relegated to secondary status at best. But what worried me more was how quickly Ryan seemed to be accepting this dynamic, as if his promotion had somehow shifted the balance of power in our household. We should definitely consider some updates, Ryan agreed, still looking at the catalog pages. Maybe not everything at once, but we could start with the living room and see how it looks. We? I asked. Or you and your mother? Ryan looked at me with surprise, as if my question had come from nowhere. All of us, obviously. This affects the whole household, but the final decision would be yours, Patricia added helpfully, since it's your house and your money paying for the improvements. I felt something snap inside me like a rubber band stretched too far. The casual assumption that Ryan's raise gave him unilateral authority over our home decor, combined with Patricia's constant reminders that I was somehow a junior partner in my own marriage, had pushed me past the point of diplomatic restraint. Actually, I said, my voice coming out colder and sharper than I'd intended, I think we need to have a serious conversation about whose house this actually is, and who gets to make decisions about how our money is spent. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ryan and Patricia both looked at me with the startled expressions of people who'd been having a pleasant conversation, and suddenly found themselves in the middle of a confrontation. Jess, Ryan said carefully, what's that supposed to mean? It means that I'm tired of being treated like a guest in my own home and a subordinate in my own marriage. It means that decisions about furniture and finances and household management are decisions we make together, not decisions your mother makes for us. Patricia's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked suspiciously like anger. Jessica, I think you're overreacting to what is simply good family support during a transition period. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've moved into our house and immediately started making unilateral decisions about how we should live, what we should buy, and who has authority over our daily routines. Ryan's house, Patricia corrected automatically, and I'm trying to help him create a more organized, mature living environment. Our house, I corrected back, putting emphasis on the word that Patricia seemed determined to ignore. And decisions about our living environment are ours to make. Ryan looked between his wife and his mother with the expression of someone who'd walked into a minefield without a map. Okay, everyone just calm down. We're family here. We should be able to work together on this stuff. Family members don't reorganize each other's workspaces without permission, I said. Family members don't make major purchases for other people's homes. Family members don't create household schedules that treat other adults like employees. Jessica, Patricia said, her voice taking on the patient tone adults use with unreasonable children. I understand that change can be difficult, but these improvements benefit everyone. Ryan appreciates having better organization and more sophisticated surroundings. Has Ryan told you he appreciates these changes, or are you assuming he does? Both women looked at Ryan, who suddenly found himself in the position of having to choose sides in a conflict he'd been trying to avoid since his mother moved in. The moment of truth had arrived, though I didn't yet realize that the biggest revelation was still to come. Ryan stood frozen in the middle of my office, his promotion celebration forgotten as he found himself caught between two women who were staring at him with very different expectations. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Patricia took charge of the moment with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her position in any family hierarchy. "Ryan, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I think Jessica is feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the changes happening at once. Perhaps you could help her understand that the improvements I'm suggesting are meant to benefit everyone, including her." The way she phrased it, positioning herself as the reasonable adult helping Ryan manage his unreasonable wife, made my stomach clench with anger. But what made it worse was the way Ryan's face relaxed slightly, as if his mother had offered him a lifeline in navigating a situation he found confusing and uncomfortable. "Jess," he said, turning to me with the cautious tone people use when they're trying to diffuse a situation they don't fully understand. "Mom's just trying to help. She's got great taste, and she knows about organizing systems from her work at the law firm. Maybe we should listen to her suggestions before getting upset about them." The automatic assumption that my objections were emotional rather than rational was exactly what I'd feared would happen. In Ryan's mind, his mother was offering practical expertise while his wife was having an emotional overreaction to change. The possibility that I might have legitimate concerns about being excluded from decisions about my own home seemed not to have occurred to him. "I'm not upset about suggestions," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "I'm upset about decisions being made without consulting me. There's a difference between offering advice and reorganizing someone's workspace, purchasing expensive appliances, and planning to redecorate the entire house." "Those aren't decisions, dear," Patricia interjected smoothly. "Those are improvements. No one's making permanent changes without proper discussion. Spending thousands of dollars on furniture isn't a permanent change. Not when it's an investment in creating a more sophisticated living environment that benefits everyone," Patricia replied. "Ryan's promotion means he'll be entertaining clients more frequently. He needs a home that reflects his professional status." This was news to me. Ryan had never mentioned entertaining clients at home, and in 4 years of marriage we'd hosted exactly 3 work-related gatherings. All of them casual backyard barbecues that hadn't required leather furniture or sophisticated decor. But Patricia spoke with the authority of someone who'd already discussed these professional requirements with Ryan privately. "When did we decide I'd be entertaining clients at home?" Ryan asked, looking confused. "Well, naturally, as you advance in your career, you'll want to host more business-related social events," Patricia explained patiently. "It's expected at your level. Partners and senior associates often invite clients and colleagues to their homes for dinner parties and informal meetings. Your current furniture is perfectly adequate for a young couple's casual lifestyle, but it won't make the right impression for professional entertaining." I watched Ryan process this information, seeing him consider possibilities he'd apparently never thought about before. The idea of hosting sophisticated dinner parties and business meetings seemed to appeal to him, or at least to appeal to his vision of himself as a successful professional. "I guess that makes sense," he said slowly. "I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're probably right about needing a more professional environment." "Of course I'm right," Patricia said with satisfaction. "I spent 30 years observing how successful people live and entertain. I know what creates the right impression." The ease with which she'd planted the idea of professional entertaining requirements and watched Ryan embrace it was masterful manipulation. Within 5 minutes, she'd created a justification for her expensive redecorating plans that made them seem like career necessities rather than personal preferences. "But we should probably discuss this as a couple before making any major purchases," I said, trying to reassert some partnership dynamic into the conversation. "Of course," Ryan agreed, though his tone suggested he viewed this as a formality rather than a genuine consultation. "We'll talk about it tonight." "Wonderful," Patricia said, gathering her catalogs with obvious satisfaction. "I'll call Margaret and let her know we're moving forward with the updates. She'll be so excited to help us choose the right pieces." The assumption that we included her in our decision-making process was stunning. But what bothered me more was how quickly Ryan had accepted his mother's professional, entertaining narrative, and the furniture expenses that came with it. That evening, Ryan and I sat at our kitchen table with takeout Chinese food and Patricia's decorator catalog spread between us like evidence in a negotiation. Patricia herself was upstairs, having graciously given us privacy to discuss household finances, after making it clear that she expected us to reach the conclusion she'd already decided was correct. "Okay," Ryan said. opening a container of lo mein. Let's talk through this rationally. Mom's suggestions are expensive, but if I'm going to be advancing in the firm, maybe it makes sense to invest in our home environment. When exactly did you decide you wanted to entertain clients at home? I asked. Because in 4 years of marriage, you've never once mentioned having work dinners or business meetings here. Ryan looked defensive. I haven't needed to before, but things are changing. This promotion puts me on track for partnership. And partners do entertain. Mom's right about that. Maybe they do, but shouldn't we decide together what kind of entertaining we want to do and what our budget can handle? Of course we should decide together. That's what we're doing right now. But it didn't feel like a joint decision. It felt like Ryan had already been convinced by his mother's arguments, and was now trying to convince me to agree with conclusions he'd already reached. The consultation felt perfunctory, a box to check before implementing plans that had already been approved by the people who really mattered. Ryan, I said carefully, do you realize that your mother has been making unilateral changes to our house since the day she moved in? She's reorganized my kitchen, taken over my office, created household schedules, and now she's planning to redecorate our entire living space. Doesn't any of that concern you? She's trying to help, Jess. She's got experience with organization and professional environments. I think you're taking this too personally. Taking it personally? This is my home. How else should I take it? Our home, Ryan corrected automatically but without much conviction. Right, our home. So why is your mother making decisions about our home without consulting me? Ryan set down his chopsticks and looked at me with the expression of someone trying to explain something obvious to someone who is being deliberately obtuse. Because she knows about these things, and because she's trying to help us create something better than what we had before. You're acting like she's trying to hurt us when she's actually trying to improve our situation. The complete absence of concern about my exclusion from household decisions was breathtaking. In Ryan's mind, his mother's expertise and good intentions trumped any need to include his wife in choices about their shared living space. It's not about her intentions, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. It's about the fact that decisions about our home should be decisions we make together, not decisions she makes for us. But if she has better ideas than we do, why wouldn't we want her input? Input is different from unilateral decision-making. Input is offering suggestions and letting us choose what to do with them. What your mother is doing is implementing her preferences and expecting us to accommodate them. Ryan was quiet for a moment, turning this over in his mind. For a brief moment, I thought I might be getting through to him, that he might recognize the difference between helpful advice and authoritarian control. Maybe you're right that she's been a little assertive about some things, he said finally. But she's been living alone for years, and she's used to making decisions without consulting anyone. It's probably just going to take time for her to adjust to living with other people again. The excuse-making was depressingly familiar. Instead of acknowledging that his mother's behavior was inappropriate, Ryan was explaining why it was understandable, as if understanding her motivations somehow made the impact on our marriage irrelevant. How much time? I asked. Because she's been here a week and she's already taken over my workspace, reorganized my kitchen, scheduled my bathroom usage, and planned to spend thousands of dollars redecorating our house. What's she going to control next week? You're exaggerating, Ryan said, but he sounded less certain than before. Am I? Let me ask you this. When was the last time you made a decision about our household without consulting her first? Ryan opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again as he apparently tried to think of an example and couldn't find one. She's been here for 7 days, I continued. In that time, have you once said no to any of her suggestions? Have you once told her that you needed to discuss something with your wife before agreeing to it? Have you once prioritized my comfort and preferences over her organizational schemes? The questions hung in the air between us, and I could see Ryan struggling with the implications of his answers. But instead of acknowledging the pattern I was describing, he got defensive. It's not that simple, Jess. She's my mother, and she's going through a difficult time with her housing situation. I can't just tell her that her help isn't welcome. I'm not asking you to tell her that her help isn't welcome. I'm asking you to include me in decisions about our home and our money. I am including you. We're talking about it right now. After she's already ordered the coffee maker, planned the furniture purchases, and convinced you that you need to entertain clients at home. This isn't a consultation, Ryan. This is you asking me to approve decisions that have already been made. The conversation was going in circles, with Ryan unable to see the difference between genuine partnership and post-facto approval of his mother's plans. Every time I tried to explain why his mother's behavior was problematic, he reframed it as her being helpful in ways that I was too stubborn or emotional to appreciate. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted our discussion. Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing an elegant navy dress and pearls, looking like she was dressed for dinner at a country club rather than an evening at home. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, though her tone suggested she had no intention of leaving regardless of whether she was interrupting or not. "I just wanted to let you know that I've made dinner reservations for tomorrow night at the Riverside Club. I thought it would be nice for us to celebrate Ryan's promotion properly." The Riverside Club was the most expensive restaurant in our area, the kind of place where dinner for 3 people could easily cost more than our monthly grocery budget. It was also the kind of place that required advance reservations and a dress code that neither Ryan nor I owned clothes for. "That's very generous, Mom," Ryan said, "but you didn't need to." "Nonsense," Patricia interrupted. "This is a significant achievement, and it deserves to be celebrated appropriately. I've taken the liberty of arranging everything. 7 o'clock tomorrow evening." Once again, Patricia had made expensive plans for our family without consulting anyone, presented them as a fait accompli, and expected us to accommodate her decisions. The pattern was so consistent it was almost comical, except that there was nothing funny about watching my husband accept his mother's financial generosity, without questioning whether I might have preferred to be included in planning his promotion celebration. "That sounds wonderful," Ryan said, apparently oblivious to the fact that neither of us had been asked whether we wanted to spend our Saturday evening at an expensive restaurant we'd never chosen. "Excellent," Patricia replied. "I've also taken the liberty of making an appointment for Jessica at the salon tomorrow afternoon. Margaret recommended an excellent place that can help her find a more sophisticated hairstyle for the occasion." The casual assumption that my current hairstyle was inadequate for public appearances was the final straw. I felt something snap inside me like a wire pulled too tight. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice coming out sharper and louder than I'd intended. Patricia looked at me with mild surprise, as if she'd made a perfectly reasonable suggestion and couldn't understand why I might object to it. "The salon appointment, dear. You'll want to look your best for Ryan's celebration dinner, and Margaret says this stylist is wonderful at creating more mature, professional looks." The implication that I currently looked neither mature nor professional was insulting enough, but what made it worse was the way she'd made these arrangements without asking me, then presented them as something I should be grateful for. "I didn't ask you to make salon appointments for me," I said, standing up from the table with enough force that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I didn't ask you to make dinner reservations for us. I didn't ask you to reorganize my kitchen, redecorate my house, or schedule my daily routine." "Jessica," Patricia said, her voice taking on the patient tone that made me want to scream, "I'm simply trying to help you present yourself appropriately for important family occasions. By making decisions about my appearance without consulting me? By offering guidance that will help you understand what's expected in Ryan's professional social circle." The conversation had shifted from household management to personal criticism, and I realized that Patricia's control issues extended far beyond furniture choices and organizational systems. She genuinely believed that I was inadequate as Ryan's wife and needed her intervention to become someone worthy of his success. "What exactly do you think is wrong with how I present myself?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Ryan looked between his wife and his mother with growing alarm, apparently realizing that this conversation was heading somewhere much more serious than disagreements about furniture and dinner reservations. "Jessica," he said quickly, "I'm sure Mom didn't mean—" "Let her answer," I interrupted, keeping my eyes fixed on Patricia. "I want to know exactly what she thinks needs to be fixed about me." Patricia's composure never wavered, but I caught a flash of something calculating in her eyes, as if she was deciding how much truth to reveal about what she really thought of her son's choice in wives. "I simply think," she said carefully, "that as Ryan advances in his career, it would benefit both of you if you developed a more polished, professional presentation. Your current style is perfectly fine for casual situations, but Ryan will be moving in circles where image matters. What specifically about my image needs improvement? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Patricia weighing her options between diplomatic evasion and honest criticism. She chose honesty, and it was exactly as brutal as I'd expected it to be. Patricia straightened her shoulders and looked at me with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a piece of furniture that might or might not be worth keeping. "Since you insist on specifics," she said, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency she'd probably used when delivering performance reviews at the law firm, "I think your overall presentation lacks the sophistication that Ryan's new position will require. Your hairstyle is casual. Your wardrobe choices lean toward what I'd call artsy student rather than professional wife. And your general approach to social situations suggests you're not quite prepared for the kind of networking and entertaining that will be expected of you." The systematic demolition of my appearance, my style, and my social competence was delivered with such professional precision that for a moment I was too stunned to respond. Patricia had clearly been cataloging my deficiencies since the moment she'd moved in, and she'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity to present her findings. Furthermore, she continued, apparently taking my silence as permission to elaborate, "Your domestic skills, while adequate for a young couple's informal lifestyle, will need significant improvement if you're going to be hosting the kind of dinner parties and social gatherings that Ryan's colleagues will expect. The way you've decorated this house, the meals you prepare, even the way you manage household schedules, it all needs to be elevated to match Ryan's professional status." Ryan sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at his mother with an expression of horror that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the scope of her criticism of his wife. But he still didn't intervene, still didn't tell his mother that her assessment was inappropriate or unwelcome. And finally, Patricia said, delivering what was clearly meant to be her most devastating observation, "Your attitude toward constructive criticism and helpful guidance suggests that you're not quite ready to be the kind of supportive partner that successful men need. Ryan deserves a wife who enhances his career prospects rather than limiting them." The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Patricia stood there looking satisfied with her comprehensive evaluation, as if she'd performed a necessary service by pointing out all the ways I was failing as a wife, and would continue to fail unless I submitted to her guidance and management. Ryan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom," he said, that's really harsh." "It's honest," Patricia replied firmly. "And honesty is what families owe each other." Jessica asked for specifics, and I gave them to her. "If she's going to help rather than hinder your career advancement, she needs to understand what's expected." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Patricia had just systematically attacked my appearance, my competence, my domestic skills, and my worthiness as a wife, then presented it as loving family honesty that I should be grateful to receive. But what was even worse was the way she'd positioned herself as the expert on what Ryan needed and deserved, as if his happiness and success were things only she truly understood and cared about. In her narrative, I was the obstacle to Ryan's potential, and she was the wise mother helping him overcome that obstacle. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of every insult and implication, letting the full scope of Patricia's contempt for me settle into my bones. This wasn't about organizational systems or furniture choices, or even salon appointments. This was about a woman who fundamentally believed that her son had married beneath him and that her role was to either fix me or replace me. "You're right," I said finally, my voice surprisingly steady. "We do owe each other honesty, so let me be honest about something that might change your perspective on this entire conversation." Both Ryan and Patricia looked at me with expressions of wary curiosity, as if they weren't sure what kind of response to expect but sensed it might not be what they anticipated. "Patricia," I continued, "you've spent the past week talking about Ryan's house and Ryan's decisions, and what Ryan deserves from his living environment and his wife. You've made assumptions about who has authority in this household, and who gets to make decisions about furniture and finances and guest accommodations." I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up my purse, pulling out my keys with deliberate slowness. "But before you continue planning expensive renovations and social obligations and improvements to my personal presentation, There's something you should probably know about whose house this actually is." I could see confusion flickering across both their faces, as if they couldn't imagine what piece of information I might possess that would be relevant to Patricia's comprehensive critique of my inadequacies. "Ryan," I said, turning to my husband, "when we applied for this mortgage 4 years ago, do you remember why the loan application was submitted in my name only?" Ryan's face went pale as the memory apparently came flooding back. Because my credit score wasn't good enough to qualify for the rate we wanted." "That's right. And do you remember what the mortgage broker suggested about adding your name to the deed later?" "He said we could do it once my credit improved," Ryan said slowly, his voice getting quieter as he began to understand where this conversation was heading. "And did we ever do that? Did we ever add your name to the property deed?" The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from the next room. Ryan stared at me with growing comprehension and what looked suspiciously like panic. We talked about it, but we never... it seemed like paperwork that could wait. So just to be absolutely clear," I said, pulling a folded document from my purse and setting it on the table between us, "the deed to this property lists exactly one owner, not Ryan, not both of us, just me." I unfolded the deed and turned it so they could both read the header clearly. "Jessica Marie Thompson, sole owner of the property located at 247 Willowbrook Drive, Millbrook Heights, Ohio." Patricia stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language she couldn't decipher. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, as if her brain was struggling to process information that didn't fit with any of her assumptions about our household hierarchy. "That's not possible," she said finally. "Ryan bought this house. Ryan pays the mortgage. This is Ryan's investment and Ryan's property." "Actually," I said, my voice gaining strength as I watched Patricia's confident authority crumble, "I pay the mortgage. Every month, automatically, from my business account. I pay the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, and the maintenance costs. I own this house outright, and I have since the day we closed on it 4 years ago." Ryan had gone from pale to gray, staring at the deed like it might change if he looked at it hard enough. "Jess, I didn't realize. I thought of it as our house, regardless of whose name was on the paperwork." "And it is our house, as far as our marriage is concerned," I agreed. But Patricia doesn't seem to understand the concept of marital partnership. She seems to think that authority in this household flows from property ownership and financial responsibility. So I thought I should clarify exactly who owns what and who pays for what. I turned to face Patricia directly, feeling something like electricity running through my veins as I finally stopped being defensive and went on the offensive. "You've spent a week telling me that this is Ryan's house, and that Ryan gets to make decisions about furniture and renovations because he's the head of the household with financial responsibility for our living situation. You've dismissed my income as hobby money and treated my preferences as inconvenient obstacles to your son's success." Patricia was still staring at the deed, apparently unable to process the fundamental shift in power dynamics that this revelation represented. "But the reality is that I own this house. I pay for this house. And every single improvement you've been planning, the furniture, the renovations, the sophisticated living environment, would be paid for with my money in my house according to my approval." The words felt like oxygen after a week of holding my breath. For 7 days, I'd been treated like a subordinate in my own home, and now I was finally able to establish exactly who had authority over what. "Furthermore," I continued, "every organizational change you've made, every schedule you've created, and every household rule you've implemented has been done in a house that belongs entirely to me. You've been a guest in my home, making decisions about my property, with my husband's permission but not mine." Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Jess, I'm so sorry. I didn't think about the ownership thing. I thought of it as our house, so I figured..." "You figured your mother could make decisions about our house without consulting me," I finished. "You figured her expertise trumped my preferences in my own home. You figured wrong." Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out shaky and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "But you're married," she said, as if this somehow negated the legal reality of property ownership. Married couples share assets. What's yours is his, and what's his is yours. To some extent, that's true, I agreed. But you haven't been treating us like a married couple making joint decisions. You've been treating Ryan like the authority figure, and me like the person whose preferences don't matter. You've been operating under the assumption that he owns this house and I live here by his permission. I picked up the deed and held it so she could see the official seal and notarized signatures. But the legal reality is exactly the opposite. Ryan lives here by my permission. You're staying here by my permission. And every change you want to make to Ryan's house actually requires approval from me, because this is my house. The shift in power dynamics was so dramatic that I could practically see Patricia recalculating every interaction we'd had since she'd moved in. Every assumption about authority and hierarchy, every dismissal of my preferences, every assertion of her right to make decisions about our household. All of it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually owned what. This changes everything, she said quietly, more to herself than to either of us. It changes your assumptions, I corrected. The facts have been the same all along. You just didn't bother to learn what they were before you started making decisions based on what you thought you knew. Ryan had been silent through this entire exchange, staring at the table like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complicated than he'd expected. Ryan, I said, drawing his attention back to the conversation, do you have anything you'd like to say about this situation? He looked up at me with an expression that combined embarrassment, confusion, and something that might have been respect. I owe you a huge apology, he said finally. I've been letting Mom make decisions about our home without consulting you, and I've been treating you like you didn't have equal say in what happened here. That was wrong, regardless of whose name is on the deed. It was the first acknowledgement I'd gotten from him that our partnership had been compromised by his mother's presence, and while it didn't fix everything, it was a start. And? I prompted, sensing there was more he needed to say. And I should have stood up for you when Mom started criticizing your appearance, and your competence and your worthiness as my wife. That was completely inappropriate, and I should have stopped it immediately. Patricia's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. I was trying to help her understand. You were trying to control and manipulate, I interrupted. You were trying to remake me into your vision of what Ryan's wife should be, without any regard for what Ryan actually wants or what I'm actually capable of. What I want, Ryan said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all evening, is a wife who challenges me and supports me and builds a life with me as an equal partner. What I want is exactly what I've had for 4 years, before anyone convinced me that I needed something different or better. The declaration was more definitive than anything Ryan had said since his mother moved in, and I felt some of the tension in my chest begin to loosen. Good, I said, because that's exactly what you have. The question now is whether your mother can accept that, or whether she needs to find alternative housing arrangements while her apartment building gets repaired. The ultimatum hung in the air between us, and I could see Patricia realizing that her week of assumed authority had just evaporated completely. She was no longer the matriarch managing her son's household. She was a guest whose welcome depended entirely on her ability to respect the actual power dynamics in my home. The choice was hers, but the authority was mine, and everyone in the kitchen finally understood exactly how that equation worked. The silence that followed my ultimatum stretched for what felt like an eternity. Patricia sat at my kitchen table, staring at the property deed like it was evidence of a crime she couldn't quite comprehend. Her perfectly composed facade had cracked completely, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. I need a moment to process this, she said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I seemed to have misunderstood several things about this situation. It was the closest thing to an admission of error I'd ever heard from Patricia, and even that came wrapped in passive language that avoided taking direct responsibility for her assumptions and behavior. Take all the time you need, I replied, folding the deed and putting it back in my purse. But I want to be clear about what needs to change if you're going to continue staying here. Ryan looked between his wife and his mother with the expression of someone watching a chess game where the rules had suddenly changed, and he wasn't sure who was winning anymore. Patricia's carefully manicured hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. What? What kind of changes are you talking about? The question came out tentative, almost fearful, as if she was finally beginning to understand that her week of assumed authority had been built on completely false premises. First, I said, settling back into my chair with the confidence of someone who finally held all the cards. All household decisions go through both Ryan and me. No more reorganizing my workspace. No more purchasing appliances or furniture without consultation. No more creating schedules that treat me like household staff. Patricia nodded slowly, though I could see her struggling with the concept of asking permission for things she'd been doing unilaterally for a week. Second, any expenses related to this house or this household get approved by me, since I'm the one who pays for everything. That includes your dinner reservations, your salon appointments, and your decorator friends' furniture suggestions. I can pay for my own dinner reservations, Patricia said quickly, apparently eager to demonstrate some form of independence. That's fine, but you can't make social commitments for Ryan and me without asking us first. Our time isn't yours to schedule. Of course, she agreed, though her voice carried the strain of someone agreeing to terms she found fundamentally unreasonable. Third, and this is non-negotiable, I continued, there will be no more criticism of my appearance, my domestic skills, my professional competence, or my worthiness as Ryan's wife. You don't have to like my hairstyle or my decorating choices, but you do have to keep your opinions to yourself. Patricia's face flushed again, this time definitely from embarrassment rather than anger. I was only trying to... I know what you were trying to do, I interrupted. You were trying to remake me into your vision of what a successful man's wife should look like. But Ryan married me, not your vision of me. If he wanted someone different, he would have married someone different. Ryan reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. I love exactly who you are, Jess. I don't want you to change anything about yourself to meet anyone else's expectations. It was the most definitive statement of support he'd made since his mother had moved in, and I felt some of the hurt and anger I'd been carrying begin to ease. Thank you, I said, squeezing his hand back. That means more than you know. Patricia watched this exchange with something that looked like genuine surprise, as if she'd never considered that Ryan might actually prefer his wife's authentic personality to some polished version she could help create. I think, she said slowly, I may have been operating under some incorrect assumptions about what you both wanted from this living arrangement. What we want, Ryan said, is for our home to feel like our home again. We want to make decisions together as a couple, without feeling like we need approval or supervision from anyone else. And we want you to feel welcome here, I added, but as a guest who respects our autonomy, not as a manager who thinks we need fixing. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing the gap between what she'd thought her role would be and what we were actually offering her. I may have been overly enthusiastic about helping you establish a more organized household, she admitted finally. I'm used to managing things at the law firm, and I suppose I brought that approach home with me. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was an acknowledgement that her management style had been inappropriate for our family situation. The thing is, Mom, Ryan said gently, we weren't looking for management. We were offering you a place to stay during a housing emergency. Those are very different things. I see that now, Patricia replied, though her tone suggested she was still struggling to accept the fundamental shift in dynamics. Over the next hour, we worked out the practical details of what Patricia's continued presence in our home would look like. She would keep the guest bedroom but respect our privacy and autonomy. She would contribute to household expenses proportional to her usage but wouldn't make purchasing decisions for us. She would be welcome to offer suggestions about organization or decoration, but only when asked, and with the understanding that we might choose not to implement them. Most importantly, she would treat both Ryan and me as equal partners in our marriage and equal decision-makers in our home, regardless of her opinions about gender roles or household hierarchy. I think I can live with those terms, Patricia said when we'd finished outlining the new arrangement, though I admit it will be an adjustment for me. It'll be an adjustment for all of us, I replied, but it's the only way this is going to work. The next morning, I woke up to the familiar sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen. But this time it was coming from my French press, rather than Patricia's programmable machine. I found her sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual business attire. Good morning, she said, looking up from the paper. I hope you don't mind that I made coffee. I used your French press since you seem to prefer it. That's perfectly fine, I replied, surprised by both the gesture and the casual way she'd asked permission for something she'd been doing automatically for a week. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, Patricia said as I poured myself coffee from the press. I owe you a more direct apology than I gave you yesterday. I sat down across from her, curious about what had prompted this change in tone. I spent 30 years in an environment where hierarchy and authority were clearly defined, she continued. I was good at my job precisely because I could assess situations and implement improvements without needing consensus or extended consultation. But that approach is completely inappropriate in someone else's family. It was the most self-aware thing I'd heard Patricia say since she'd moved in. I also realized, she went on, that I'd been thinking about Ryan's marriage the way I thought about his childhood. When he was growing up, it was my job to guide his choices and help him become the kind of person I thought he should be. But he's an adult now, and the choices he's made about his life and his partner aren't mine to evaluate or improve. The acknowledgement that Ryan's marriage was his own to manage, not hers to supervise, felt like a fundamental breakthrough. I appreciate you saying that, I said. It can't be easy to shift from being the primary influence in someone's life to being a supportive observer. It's not, Patricia admitted. But watching you stand up for yourself and your marriage last night made me realize that Ryan chose someone with backbone and intelligence. Those are good qualities in a wife, even if they make her less amenable to unsolicited guidance. It was probably the closest thing to a compliment Patricia had ever given me, and it came wrapped in an acknowledgement that her guidance had indeed been unsolicited and unwelcome. Ryan appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking cautiously optimistic about the peaceful scene he was witnessing. "Morning," he said, giving me a kiss and nodding to his mother. "Everything okay in here?" "Your wife and I have been having a productive conversation about boundaries and respect," Patricia replied. "I think we understand each other better now." "Good," Ryan said, settling into his chair with obvious relief. "Because I was thinking we should cancel those dinner reservations for tonight and just order pizza and watch a movie at home. As a family, but a relaxed family." "That sounds perfect," I agreed. "I'd like that," Patricia added, though I should probably call the restaurant and cancel the reservation myself, since I made it without consulting anyone. It was a small gesture, but it represented exactly the kind of accountability and respect for our autonomy that I'd been hoping to see. 3 weeks later, Patricia's apartment building was declared structurally sound and ready for residents to return. She'd packed her belongings with the same efficiency she'd brought to unpacking them, but the energy around her departure was completely different from the energy that had surrounded her arrival. "I want to thank you both for letting me stay here," she said as Ryan loaded her suitcases into his truck. "I know it wasn't always easy, especially in the beginning when I was adjusting to your household dynamics." "It was an adjustment for all of us," I replied. "But I think we all learned something important about communication and respect." "I certainly did," Patricia agreed. "I learned that my son married someone who won't be pushed around, which is exactly what he needed, even if I didn't recognize it at first." She turned to Ryan, who was securing the last of her bags in the truck bed. "Take care of her," she said, "and let her take care of you. Partnership isn't about one person being in charge. It's about both people being strong enough to support each other." "I will, Mom," Ryan replied, giving her a hug. "And thanks for learning to see us as a team instead of as individuals who needed management." After Patricia left, Ryan and I sat on our front porch swing, enjoying the quiet of our house and the return of our normal routines. "I owe you another apology," Ryan said, taking my hand, "for letting her make you feel like a guest in your own home, for not standing up for you when she criticized you, for forgetting that we're supposed to be partners in everything." "What matters is that you remember it now," I replied, "and that you don't forget it again the next time someone tries to tell us how our marriage should work." "Never again," Ryan promised. "From now on, it's just us making decisions about our life together. No matter who thinks they know better." 6 months later, we refinanced the house and added Ryan's name to the deed, not because anyone questioned my ownership, but because we wanted our legal partnership to match our emotional one. It was a decision we made together, on our timeline for our reasons. Patricia visited regularly, but always as a welcomed guest, rather than an assumed authority figure. She offered suggestions when asked, and kept her opinions to herself when they weren't requested. She learned to appreciate the home we'd built together instead of trying to remake it into something she thought we should want. And I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to let them treat you as less than you are, even when standing up for yourself feels uncomfortable or confrontational. The house at 247 Willowbrook Drive remained exactly what it had always been, a home built by two people who loved each other enough to fight for their partnership, even when that fight meant challenging the people who were supposed to love them most. My name was on the deed, but our love built the home, and in the end, that was the only authority that really mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.